Good evening. It's just past 6 o'clock, so I may say good evening instead of good afternoon, but you're very welcome. My name is Ralph Cicerone. I'm president of the National Academy of Sciences, and it's a wonderful honor and a pleasure to welcome you here tonight and to tell you just a bit about the lecture and the lecturer. This is our 15th annual Arthur M. Sackler Lecture, and the lecture is presented along with the National Academy of Sciences Sackler Colloquium on drawing causal inference from big data. First of all, I want to recognize and thank Dame Jillian Sackler for her sponsorship of this entire program. Would you mind standing and saying hello, Jill? She serves as president and chief executive officer of the Arthur M. Sackler Foundation for the Arts, Sciences, and Humanities, and they do wonderful work in all three of those major endeavors. And she has funded this program at the National Academy of Sciences in memory of her husband. We are in our 15th year, as I said, of these successful programs, and in the program, the inside front cover has a very brief summary of Dr. Sackler's career in these three major endeavors. It's quite impressive. At our conferences, we try to bring together people around different disciplines that sometimes don't interact, so the programs tend to be interdisciplinary, to bring together this diverse group of researchers and practitioners on topics that are usually of broad current interest, like today. And each year, one of the colloquia, out of several colloquia each year, one of them will feature the annual public lecture, as tonight's program exemplifies. The colloquium has been organized by Professor Rich Schifrin from Indiana University, Suzanne Dumais, Mike Harlowitz, Jennifer Hill, Michael Jordan, Bernard Scholkopf, and Jajit Sekon. And I want to thank all of them on the organizing committee for how effectively they work to assemble just a stellar roster of speakers from different disciplines to examine how this so-called big data phenomenon is now being used in social networks, medicine, health, economics, business, internet search engines, genetics, and for all kinds of mischief. Well, that's just one person's opinion. I now have the honor of introducing tonight's speaker, Professor Stephen Levitt. Dr. Levitt received his PhD. I suppose he earned it also at MIT. He didn't just receive it. And that alone is a major accomplishment these days. He serves as the William B. Ogden Distinguished Service Professor of Economics at the University of Chicago, where he also directs the Initiative on Price Theory and Chicago Experiments at the Becker-Friedman Institute, of course, named after Gary Becker and Milton Friedman. In 2003, he won a major award, the John Bates Clark Medal, given by the American Economics Association. At the time, I think that medal was only given every 2 years to the person judged to be the outstanding economist in the United States under the age of 40. Some years later, maybe around 2010, the award began to be given annually. So it's very, very competitive, highly selective award, and it really is very meaningful. He was also named one of the Time magazine's 100 people who shaped the world in 2006. He's the co-author of the 2005 book, Freakonomics, and a 2007 sequel entitled Super Freakonomics, which serve both as economic textbooks and as a series of cautionary tales about the fallacy of conventional wisdom, not only in economics, but in our daily lives. In 2014, he published Think Like a Freak, which describes an entirely new way to solve problems. He asks very provocative questions that I think all of us can identify with, and looks at standard as well as alternative ways of answering those questions. So we look forward to hearing his thoughts on the topic today. Professor Levitt, thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Ralph. Thank you all for being here. It's wonderful to be able to talk to you, and an honor to be associated with the names of the presenters at this conference and the past speakers in this series. So my first taste of big data, I think, would have been about 1998 or 1999. I was in Washington, D.C. I opened up the newspaper, and there was a little blurb that said that there had been a whistleblower in Japan who claimed that sumo wrestling was fixed. Okay? And I didn't know anything about sumo wrestling, but I was obsessed with the ideas of cheating and corruption. And I thought, well, you know, usually when somebody says something's fixed, it probably is fixed, and maybe I could do an academic paper on it. Now, that might have seemed like a pretty stupid idea, but it was the idea I had. So I went to my computer. I mean, this is so long ago that I went through. So it used to be, before Google changed the world, that you'd go to, say, something like Lycos, and you type in something and nothing you ever wanted would ever come up, okay? And then you go to Alta Vista, the same thing. So I did this, and that morning, someone had said to me, hey, I've never heard of this thing Google before, but it's really, I typed something into it, it was amazing. So literally the first time I ever used Google, I just tried the other two search engines I usually used, and I had typed in and found nothing that would help me write this paper. And so, you know, completely, with no hope at all, I typed in the first 3 words I ever typed into Google were machine-readable sumo data. Okay, 4 words, okay? And it was truly unbelievable because the very first thing that came up, this back, like when the internet had hardly anything, the very first thing that came up was a link to, I guess it was, the guy's name is Jerry Yang or something from Yahoo, who turns out he loves sumo wrestling more than anything. And so he had hired someone to type in the results of every sumo match that had occurred in the last 30 years in Japan. And literally I got connected to a link of like of an Excel file that gave me, 2/3 of all the data I would need to write a paper. Now, just to put in perspective what it was like to do economics back then, I mean, it was hard. So my friend Josh Angerst at MIT, he was doing a lot of work on the census. And there was a room at this place called the National Bureau of Economic Research in Cambridge, and all it was were these enormous data tapes that you'd hoist off, you'd carry them to something, it would spin, and it was a full-time job for a graduate student or an undergraduate to spin the data so you could think about doing an analysis. Okay? And it would take the entire summer to do it. Now, it would just be a few years later where that same process would take about 15 minutes. Okay? But at that time, to actually be able to go on the web and get these data were truly, truly amazing. So I got these data. It turned out, as I said, it wasn't everything I needed. I did need to go and buy the last 20 years of Sumo World magazine and have an RA type in a bunch of extra stuff about the wrestlers and whatnot. But it turned out to be within about a day, I could make a graph that made me completely and totally convinced that sumo was utterly rigged. Okay, and then I did more analysis, and the patterns were unmistakable. So it turns out that so one of the themes of this talk is going to be that big data alone aren't enough. You need to understand human behavior and incentives for most of the applications. Okay, in this case, reading about sumo wrestling, I could see that that in their matches, which they have do 15 bouts as part of a 2-week match. And if you have a winning record, you win at least 8 of them, then you get promoted up the ladder. And if you have a losing record, 7 or fewer wins, you get demoted. So it turns out you could see very clearly there's a very sharp discontinuity in the incentives around the 8th win. So if there was going to be cheating, what you'd expect to happen is when 2 wrestlers met on the last day of the tournament, and one had exactly 7 wins and 7 defeats, and the other had, say, 6 wins and 8 defeats, well, the one who had 7 wins really wanted to get that 8th win, but the one who had 6 wins, the 7th win didn't matter as much as the 8th, so there were gains to trade. And if you could figure out how to cheat, you would, overall, you'd be better off. Okay, so anyway, it turns out there was a very stark pattern that showed that the people who needed these 8th wins were much more likely to win. Like they won maybe 75 or 80% of the time. Okay, and even the day before, if you had 6 wins, meaning you needed to win 2 in a row, you almost always won your 7th one and you almost always won your 8th one. Okay, so it's clear that the patent, but then people would say, well, but maybe that's not cheating, maybe that's just effort. People have a secret move, and they keep the secret move in reserve until they really need to win or something like that. You laugh, but that was my colleague Casey Mulligan's theory, was the secret move theory. But then you saw other things. It turns out, for instance, and this is the kind of thing you could only do with big data, is that you could look at every time that, say, Ralph and I had to wrestle, okay, and I needed the win that day, okay, then the next time that I met Ralph, which might be 2 months later, it might be 2 years later, it turns out he won about 80% of the matches against me the next time, 2 years off. So it really looked like very much like a tit for tat. So when I needed the win, Ralph let me in, and then I remembered that, and then in the future I paid Ralph back. And so it turns out we did this analysis. To me, it was quite convincing. Got published in a good economic journal, and we wrote about it in Freakonomics, which ended up being published in Japan. And literally, we convinced not a single person in Japan that sumo wrestling was corrupt. What's so interesting, though, is about 7 years later, they found 2 text messages from one wrestler to 2 other wrestlers saying, okay, I agree, this is the amount of money, we'll transact, I'll throw the match. It turned out those 2 text messages were enough to convince everyone in Japan that sumo wrestling was fixed. Big data had no impression whatsoever on how they did it. But that certainly fueled my optimism about how important big data could be to me as an academic economist going forward. But then, of course, a little bit taste of reality came not long after. And I was minding my own business in my office, and I got a call from this group called FinCEN. Okay, so it's the Financial Crimes and I don't know what it is, but FinCEN, it's part of the Department of Treasury. They're in charge of money laundering and whatnot. And they had read some of my articles, and they said, we really need your help. Okay, I was super excited, right? Because I already told you I was obsessed with the idea of being able to look into money laundering and crime of all sorts. And they said, there's a meeting of the G12, E15, I don't know what, some G something. And the thing is, Germany has an estimate of how much money laundering there is. The UK has an estimate of how much money laundering there is in the world. Canada has one. We don't have one. We need one. Could you make one for us? And I said, okay, just to be sure what you're saying. So you're saying you want me to estimate or make up essentially how much money laundering there is in the world? Exactly, yeah, because we need to have a number when we show up at the meeting. I said, okay, and then okay, we're going to try to then reduce that number somehow? I said, no, we're not going to try and reduce it. We just can't show up with the meeting without a number. I said, well, if that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I tell you what, I'll give you the number if we can make a deal that we'll work together to try to actually reduce the number. And they said, okay, that would be great. Because then reality said, and first of all, it was government work. So in order to actually get access to the data, it was going to be some sort of 6-month process where I got all these credentials, And then I said, well, how do you want to do it? And I said, well, I know you have these suspicious activity reports, which are, whenever someone does a bank deposit over $5,000 or something, that get filed. And I really think, in the spirit of what we now call big data, but didn't call it that then, we could pore over those data and understand some of the patterns and implications. And I said, you already do it yourself, but maybe I could help in some ways. And they said, you're welcome to do that, but the number of boxes we have of them is really overwhelming. I said, what do you mean? They said, well, we get about 1 million a year. I said, that's fine. I said, yeah, but they're just in boxes. They're not electronic. And I couldn't believe that, but it actually seemed to me. I said, well, then why do you make people file 1 million of them if all you do is put them in boxes? And they said, well, it's good to have them because when someone else catches someone else doing something bad, then we can go back and look through the boxes and trying to find evidence. And we use that in the trials to try to, as extra evidence against them. So I'm glad to say I did go back to FinCEN a few years ago, and they are no longer in boxes. But still, as far as I could tell, no one's looking at them to try to catch criminals until after they already catch the criminals. So let me just start with some. I pulled some facts about big data off the web, which I don't know if they're true, and they're so outrageous that I don't actually believe them, but it actually it makes a point about big data. So according to the internet, every minute in 2014, Facebook users share nearly 2.5 million pieces of content. This is per minute. 300,000 tweets. Over 200 million email messages are sent. Google receives over 4 million search queries, and that's doubled from just 2012, which is shocking to me. Okay, so as of 2012, the claim is that every 2 days, we create as much data, 5 exabytes, as we did from the beginning of human history to 2003. It's really, I mean, even if it's exaggerated by 100 times, it's still an amazing thing. This is one that I also find interesting. So there are over 550 billion pictures posted, shared on the web each year, and that's 7 times the number of pictures that were ever even taken in a year 15 years ago. So it's just been an absolute explosion in the amount of data out there. And so, so we talk about big data. I'm not even sure I know what big data is. I'm just going to give you my definition of big data. And it seems to me that big data has a couple of elements. One is that it's big. There's a lot of it. Okay. The second is that it's often a different kinds sources of data than we've used in the past. So typically as academics, our data sources were government surveys, and they were kind of big, but they were narrow in what they covered. Okay, and now when people think of big data, I think they think of things like scanner data, search data, really massive data sets that tend to be highly individualized, have very disaggregated data, and often have an element of real time to them. I think what makes them the most interesting when they're real time, from a business perspective in particular. For academics, we don't do anything in real time, but in businesses and in policy, we actually want stuff in real time to try to be able to make decisions. And the other thing that I think often comes with big data that makes it different and interesting, especially for academics, is the fact that it often now has less structure than what we're used to. I mean, the data sets I knew when I was coming of age in economics were, you had 50 states and you had 20 years, and it was a rectangle. So 1,000, a rectangle with 1,000 rows and as many columns. And now you have these data that are much more open-ended, like how someone's, the search patterns someone's had on the web for the last month. Some people will have none, some people will have infinite. It won't be in a line. So I think that, to me, is what is most interesting. Also, the network, the networks are what's really interesting academically. Okay, but I got to confess to you that I'm not an expert in this area at all. I am not. So the people presenting in this conference are true producers of academic insight about how to think about these data. Okay, but I'm a consumer. I'm a very active consumer as an academic of these tools and of big data. And so I write. So always my papers are data driven, and I use big data. And recently I've been doing projects which have, I think, been exactly in the sort of the heart and the spirit of the changing patterns in academics of big data. So for instance, one of the projects I've just completed started from the question that I was just interested about Hurricane Katrina. So Hurricane Katrina was this incredible catastrophe, and what makes it interesting, as well as tragic, is that there was virtually no warning. Okay, and people's lives without any warning were turned upside down. Something like half of the residents of New Orleans had to flee, maybe 25 or 30% never came back. Many people died, but it was a complete and total economic disruption of the lives of a bunch of people, and especially of a bunch of very poor people in the United States. Okay? And the question is, what happened to them? How bad was it? Okay, because we know from other settings, like if you work in a steel mill, and the steel mill closes, you will suffer economically for the rest of your life. But this is very different, because this didn't, the people in the steel mill had a very specific set of skills which are no longer valuable, because not only does their steel mill close, but a lot of other ones do as well. It's a very different kind of shock. Okay, and it's especially interesting to me in light of thinking about climate change. because it's quite likely that over the next 100 or so years, we're going to see major disruptions due to changing climates. And in terms of quantifying the costs, understanding what the human toll is of this disruption is relevant. Now, it's a different kind of disruption because the climate change one comes with a 50-year warning. Okay, and clearly you can do a lot to prepare for with 50 years, but if you start just, but it's a kind of an upper bound. The effect of the folks in New Orleans is kind of an upper bound on how much can be hurt by dislocation. Okay? Now, it turns out it's a really hard question to answer using typical data sources, because New Orleans is a small part of the US, so any survey that's done by the government doesn't have very many people from New Orleans. There's essentially no reliability. Okay, and you really want long-term impact. So it's very few of the government surveys are you going to find any evidence of where someone lived 3 years ago or 4 years ago. It's just not part of the questions to ask. I started working with a big insurance company, thinking, well, at least the thing about insurance is that the people who had insurance and lost stuff are going to keep in touch with the insurance company, so we have a way to track people. Okay, but it turned out, in the end, they weren't so interested in what I was doing, and really, it was such a incomplete subset of the data. It wasn't that good. But it turns out now, and it's almost beyond belief, and I almost hate to talk about it publicly for fear that when people understand that it exists, that people will get nervous. But it turns out through the Department of Treasury, with the right credentials, you can actually get the W-2s and the 1040s of every person in America depersonalized, but with the ability to know where they live and to track them over time. Okay, and so it's what we did. So we were able to take a pool of people, basically not a pool, but every person living in New Orleans in 2004, before the hurricane hit. And then the hard part is who's your control group? Because the problem is New Orleans is a little bit different than anywhere else on the planet. But we took a bunch of cities that look a lot like New Orleans on observables, and we took individuals from those cities and tried to match them up to the people who, and so from 2000 to 2004, the economic patterns and the ages look similar, and the marital patterns, things for those people. And then we get a shock to New Orleans, and not a shock to people who, say, lived in Cleveland or Jackson, Mississippi, or whatever the control city would have been. And we just followed them through their tax returns, and you can know a lot about people from the tax returns, because you know not only their income, but you can look at whether their dividend returns, and you can see what they're getting in terms of government, retirement and other government sources and relief and all sorts of things. And in many ways, I think it was the first real long-term look that anyone had into what happened to these folks. So what happened? So it turns out that, not surprisingly, the hurricane had a really dramatic economic effect on these folks in the beginning. So the average incomes fell by, 25 or 30%, and they stayed down for the first 2 years. They were very low. Okay? We can also follow the mobility. People moved, and then most of them, some came back, most stayed away. Then something really interesting happens. The wages of the people who lived in New Orleans at the time, now they could be spread out anywhere in the world now, anywhere in the US at least, started to rise. And by 4 years after the hurricane, their incomes were actually higher than the incomes of the control group of people who looked like them beforehand, but had lived in someplace other than New Orleans. Okay, and so it actually, and then it continues to go up. So we're extending our data now as we've gotten the latest data to see. But what it really looks like is that Hurricane Katrina just wasn't a very bad shock for people who lived in New Orleans, okay, economically. Now, I can't say anything about utility. Now, my guess is it was terrible in terms of welfare, utility, whatnot, that basically, because people could have left before, but I think, we don't know, always in economics, you can say what's in the data, and then you have to start making up stories about the why. Okay, so that's what's in the data. The why, so here's my own view of probably what happened. I think that people in general tend not to move because they get a lot of utility out of their neighborhood, their family, their friends, the people around them. Okay? But if you happen to have the bad luck to be in a place like New Orleans, where the economy was not very good, there weren't very many jobs, then you're kind of stuck economically. Then the hurricane, zaps you out of that reality and sends you off to some crazy place like Houston with no warning, and there's no New Orleans to go back to for you, and then you start maybe optimizing in a different way economically, and it turns out to be, for these folks at least, turning into more income. Okay? It's also true that New Orleans got really expensive. The cost of living in New Orleans went way up. And so in real terms, it's not clear they were a whole lot better off than they were beforehand. So part of it could be that as well. Okay? But it's a kind of study, I think, that really epitomizes the change in how economists are thinking about the world because we have access to data that allows us to answer questions we never could have answered before. Okay? So as I thought about big data and thought about my own career, one thing that became clear to me is that, or at least let me say, it was a hypothesis I had, was that the future of economics was not going to lie in government data sets, but it was going to lie in a place that was actually the most natural place to do research, which was with businesses, in partnerships, academic partnerships with business. Because the thing about the governments, they're not really in the data generation business. They're in the country running business, okay? And they throw off a few scraps to generate data for various purposes, but not really necessarily to make academics happy, more often to have statistics to be able to judge how the economy's working. But the thing about businesses, every day through their activities, they throw out enormous amounts of data, okay, about how customers responded to this price or this product, okay? And they essentially are data generators, and they're doing it anyway, so there's no marginal cost to you tagging on to do it. So I really came to believe that if you wanted to test economic theory, doing it with businesses would be the best way to do it. Okay? So as I told you, I'm no expert in big data, but it turned out that pretending to be one served me a lot of very good time in business. And they didn't know any better than to know that I wasn't an expert in big data. I had written the book Freakonomics, and even though it had nothing to do with business, Freakonomics, if you read it, it was not a business book. Some genius at the publishing company got it labeled a business book, okay? And so it ended up being the #1 business book in the country for a while. And when you have that, you automatically get anointed as a business expert, okay? And so that was wonderful because firms started calling me. CEOs would call me because I was a business expert. I'd written this best-selling book. And the conversation would usually start with them saying, hey, I loved your book. Would you come and do some work for us? And I said, well, I'd be happy to, but the thing is, I just don't know anything about business. So I know more about big data than I do about business. And they would say, oh, God, we just love that self-deprecating Midwestern charm. That's just so great. And the truth was I really didn't, but it got me the opportunity to do a whole lot of things. And I have to say that as optimistic as I started, it turned out to be a lot harder to get things done when I actually got down to it. Now, one of the first things I started was a project with a big airline. And I happened to have a chance meeting with a very high guy at the airline. And he worked in the frequent flyer program. And having thought about this, it seemed to me that the frequent flyer program was just like the lifeblood of the airline, because what an incredible luxury that you sign up almost every customer you care about, and you know every single thing they do because they work very hard to make sure that you know it because they want to get credit for the miles, okay? And so the kind of approach I've really taken through my career is what economists call a natural experiment approach or an accidental experiment approach, where you look for something like, so the gold standard, of course, is a randomized experiment. But if you can run a truly randomized experiment where I could, take, in the airline example, so if I could take a bunch of flyers, a bunch of flights, and I could just make half of them at random have a 6-hour delay, okay? The airline would let me do that. Okay, and the other would go on time. And then I'd track those passengers who got, for no good reason, no weather, no nothing, just 6 hours of punishment, okay? And then I would track their behavior over time, and I'd be able to see what the effect of a 6-hour delay was on travelers, okay? So that's what you'd love to do, but look, I can't do that. The airline's never going to let me do that. But in essence, they have that, because a lot of times, like me today, I just got whacked with a big delay for no good reason, okay? And I could have been on yesterday's flight, I could have been on tomorrow's flight, but I was on today's flight. But the people on tomorrow's flight are a lot like me, but they aren't going to get the delay, so I can use that as an accidental experiment, like a quasi-randomization, to then look and see what the behavior is going for. Okay, so I'd thought about this for a long time, but never thought I'd actually have the chance to do anything with it. And I said to the guy at the airline, God, I'm just so curious about so many questions related to this. just, you know, are you able to tell me any of the answers to these questions based on your analysis of the data? And he said, well, I run the frequent flyer program. And my job is to make sure that the people get their miles and they redeem their miles. My job is not to figure out all these other things, operational things about whether delays matter. Okay? And I was absolutely stunned that he had never thought about it. Like he didn't think that was part of his job. And I said, well, could you do it? And he said, you know, it's kind of interesting. And we had a meeting. We sat down with the IT people, and they said, to try to put together our 7 legacy data sets, to try to make them talk to each other, completely infeasible. It would be like a 5-person year task to try to do it. And I don't even think we'd succeed if we did it. Okay, so it just so happened that I had an undergraduate I really liked who had graduated, had nothing to do. And I said, hey, you know, this is a little bit crazy, but I just talked to this airline, and they said there's this impossible task, but you got nothing else to do. What if I pay you? Okay, I said to them, I'm going to pay this guy, and if you could just find a seat for him in a carol, if you let him, I just want him to mess around in your data and see if anything interesting happens. Okay, and I won't publish anything without, you know, it'd all be like covered by NDA, whatever. And it turned out they had just done a lot of downsizing. So there was an entire, you know, there's 40 carols open for the guy to sit all alone in. And I sent him down there. And it was really interesting insight into business, because his only task, I said, look, I just want you to be nice to people, smile all the time, have lunch with people, ask them about their data, and ask them if they can link, if you can get to the data set, and just see if you can find links between their different data sets of everything and see if you can put it together. It took him about 3 months, one undergraduate about 3 months, to do the thing that the IT expert at the airline said was impossible to do. And it wasn't real time, of course. It was just this one, 6-month snapshot. And we went and we looked at the data, and it was really interesting because you could see exactly. We started with the exact question I just told you about, which is to look at delays and how long delays affected travelers. And it turned out that for the really high status travelers who traveled a lot, one really bad delay cost the airline about $2,000 in revenue over the next 2 or 3 years. I mean, much bigger, I think, than they expected, much bigger than I expected. But you could see just very clearly in this sort of regression discontinuity approach that you could see it was right. And so we presented the data to the head of the frequent flyer program and others who were interested, and they were, very pleased, very excited about it. I think they believed it. They understood. I mean, the beauty of a lot of the simple methods are that, one of the beauties of quasi-randomization is people can understand it, right? If you do complicated statistics, no one can ever figure out what we're really doing. But we could just show them, here's our logic. They could see the patterns. And I really thought, this being my first experience in business, we were off to the races, right? So they're going to understand now that if one undergrad can do this in 3 months, it was worth an investment. We're going to answer every question. It doesn't matter who your pilot is, your gate crew. I mean, you could just think about pricing. I mean, everything. Then you go to randomized experiments. Why settle for these accidental things? And they said they at the end of the presentation, that's really great. And I said, what about, should we try to really blow this thing out? And the guy said, but my job is to make sure people redeem their miles and get their miles, if not really do the other thing. And as hard as I tried to convince a guy that he could be, if he wanted to be CEO, he should just take control of the whole organization. He should be the guy who basically figured out everything. Couldn't do it. Okay, so I gave up. Okay. Things got worse from there, much worse from there. So I got smarter over time. So I did all that for free, which was obviously a mistake ex post, because in the end I never got to publish anything. But so then I realized that the more I charged, the better things went with firms. And so I started charging a whole lot of money to go talk to firms. And that's how I got in with one of the biggest fast food chains in America, in the world. And they allowed me to again, they said, just do whatever you want. Just go around, you think about things differently, see if you can come up with some good ideas. And I went around to various things, and the one that stands out the most was the issue of human resources, which I just really believe that there's so many opportunities for big data exploitation of human resources, and it's just not happening. Okay, so in preparation for a meeting with the head of HR, I actually applied for a job flipping burgers at this place. And as you apply, you give them some information, and they ask you about 40 questions. Okay, and the question that I remember best, most vivid question was, you're wiping a table when a customer punches you in the face. What do you do? A, I punch him back. Okay? B, I scream, I've been punched, call 911. C, calmly walk to your supervisor and say, I've been punched. And there's a D too, I don't know what it was. Okay. So anyway, so we get in the meeting and I say to the head of HR, I said, I was really wondering what the answer, what was the right answer to question 23 about the punch thing? He said, I have no idea, I'm not sure. And I said, well, what answer, more broadly, how do you know what the right answers are? And she said, well, we hired a third-party firm, one of these big HR, Mercer, or one of these big firms, and they designed the questions and told us what the right answers were. And I said, well, how do they know what the right answers are? And the answer was, well, because they're experts, because that's what they do, they know the answer. And I said, well, which questions are the best ones? And she said, I don't know what you're talking about. I said, well, which ones are most predictive? And she, again, acted like she didn't understand what I was talking about. I said, well, by my calculation, you've had about 4 million people take this test over the last 6 or 7 years, and you've hired about 1.5 million of them, and all you got to do is just link up the answers they gave on this test to how long they stay at the company, and whether they're promoted, whether they're good, what their performances are. And then, number one, you'd really learn what the right answers were to the different questions. And then also which questions are informative, and you could, every week you could change out the questions and constantly be experimenting and having better and better tests. And she said, well, we've never done that. She said, my problem is, I'm the HR manager, and my job is to keep us from being sued because our questions are discriminatory. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't ever want to know anyone's answer to any of those questions. The third party handles that. All I see is red, yellow, green. Green means interview him for sure. Yellow means maybe, maybe not. Red says don't interview him. Okay, and that's all I want to do. I don't want to go any deeper than that. And I said, okay, well, let's just go a little further with this. And I said, we started talking about how many people they hire, their turnover. And I said, okay, I can imagine that if you did this smartly, you could reduce turnover by 10%. And I did the calculation. I can't remember exactly what it was, but I think it was something like it was worth perhaps $50 to $100 million a year to them. Okay, and I did this back of the envelope calculation. So I think this would be worth about $50 million to your bottom line. And my firm, even at our incredibly exorbitant rates, was only going to charge her maybe like $150,000. So that seems like a pretty good ROI. So it's like 50 million, but it's going to last for a long time. So it's really something more like worth a couple $100 million. Could not have been less interesting. Okay? So this story actually has an interesting ending because shortly thereafter, I was asked to speak to the 50 top people globally of this big fast food chain. They brought them all together. And because I was doing this analysis, they asked me if I would come and talk to them about their firm. And I said, sure. And I said, do you want me to just like have fun and talk about nice things like sumo wrestling and stuff like that? Or you want me to really talk about the hard facts about how you run your business? And I said, of course we want the hard facts. We want to, we're all about the truth. And so I got up in front of these 60 people and I just basically told them 3 different, I said a lot of nice things too. Then I told them 3 anecdotes exactly like this HR anecdote. And the room got quieter and quieter. And the next day, the CEO wrote an email saying that we were fired from all contracts were canceled. They didn't want to talk to us ever again. Which I thought was great, actually, because who wants to work for a company that when you tell them the truth, they don't want to, they're not interested in anyway. But it definitely was an interesting set of lessons to me here, because what I realized is this is a firm that had a lot of success. And they had a lot of success in an old model. And their old model was that, middle-aged men sat in their offices and knew better than the customer or better than the data what the answers were. Right? To be a good manager of the company, you had to guess what the answers were and do a good job of it. You had to guess, you decreed what should happen, and if you were right, things went well. But I think that is completely a model which is at odds with the new economy. Right? And you take whether it's Google or Amazon or Facebook or whatever, and here it's a different world. It's a world in which you can experiment, in which the data tell you the answers. You don't have to rely on insight. Okay? It's a very hard world for business to and I think also policymakers to transform into, where the role of the executive goes from being, I am the expert who knows everything, to my job being, can I ask the right questions, and can I marshal the right data to tell me what the answers are to those questions? Okay. So a third business experience I had, while ultimately a failure, at least was better than the first two. And it was with a newer company, an internet company, a company that provided software to people on a subscription basis. Okay, and really smart, exciting company to work with. And one of the things that they had a problem. Okay, and one of the problems was that when a year came up and it was time to renew the subscription, something like 35% of the people never renewed. Okay, and what was odd about it is that among the people who never renewed were people who the day before who were using it every day of the week up until the day they never reviewed, and then not after. Okay, now they didn't know that much about this, but they just knew they had a renewal problem, and so they had called a meeting, and it was going to be a typical meeting, like many business meetings, where people from all different functions and expertise were going to come together, and they were going to go around the room, and each person was going to offer their suggestion about how they could get these renewal rates up. Okay, and they were going to say, well, I think, so one guy was going to say, I think that the problem is really pricing, that our pricing's too high. If we lower the pricing, people would be more likely to renew. Another guy was going to say, I really think it's about the way we market the renewal to them, that we need to send emails, a week ahead of, 2 weeks at a time instead of 1 week at a time, whatever. Okay, and that's the way business works, right? There's a problem, people come together, opinions are expressed, and then essentially usually either some group opinion comes to, or more likely the most senior person decrees what the answer is, and then people go out and do it, okay? So just for fun and insight, I said, could we try something different? How about we have the first meeting, but it's only 15 minutes long. It's just to define the problem, okay? And then you let me and my team go off. So I should have said, so we did a data project there where we had tried to put together an integrated, big data set of everything that was useful at this company. Okay? And this took, 4 people at the company 6 months to do. Okay, so and this is just a snapshot. So it just goes to show how hard it is for these companies to put their data together, even though this was a relatively young, relatively good company. So we had a data set that now, with the click of a few buttons, you could get some answers. So we said, now we'll have a 15-minute meeting, and then give us a week to put together all the data that we can, relevant to the question, and then let's have the meeting in the light of the data, right? So not people's opinion about what's going on, but actually looking at the data. So in a week, we put together a bunch of information, and the most interesting thing we found is that when you just look at the error codes, something like, I think it was like 30 or 40% of all of the people who didn't renew again tried to renew, something went wrong with their credit card, and then they never tried again. Okay? And so no one knew this. No one had ever bothered to look at it. It was in the data, but it wasn't anyone's job really to look at this per thing. So we showed them a bunch of really simple sets of big bar, little bar slides of comparisons of things. Completely simple. We just divided things up, and the meeting was totally different. Because instead of a meeting being conjectures about what I think is going on and what's going on, people said, whoa, if that's really true, then the answer is this. And this was a very experimentally oriented firm. So out of the meeting, 3 randomized experiments were spawned that went on to show that indeed, when someone's credit card gets turned down, a personal call to them, at least it was just to say, hey, I noticed you had trouble with your credit card, it seems like we have the wrong address on file or something, led to about half of those people actually renewing down. So it turned out that the real solutions were not what anyone would have suspected, but was a completely different way in. Now, the reason I say it was a total failure is because everyone lauded how this worked, and the company literally never, ever did it again. Okay, that even though people loved what happened, it just wasn't the way things happened. It wasn't the natural. It was no one's job to do what we did, which was to have nothing to do but just, when given a problem, go and work on the data. Okay, and so in some sense, it was a failure in that regard as well. So, So what do I take away from these examples? These are just a quick look into some of my experience with big data. And here are my views, 15 years down the road from my first contact with big data. So as an academic, I think what I've learned is that collaboration with businesses is sure a whole lot harder than I would have thought it would have been when I started. And it really is it's a problem, it's really a problem partly of incentives, that the things that I'm interested in as an academic are rarely about profit maximization for the firm, and it's often about disruption of what they want to do. And so it's hard to make these collaborations work, whether it's done, whether it's a randomized experiment, whether it's just looking at data or anything. Okay, but at the same time, I still believe that the payoffs are so enormous relative to what the other marginal contribution economists can make in other realms, that I think it's really valuable. And I also think what's really important about these kind of business academic collaborations is that it takes a completely different set of skills, or at least a partially different set of skills than other kinds of economic research. Okay, so there's a set of people like me who can't do like crazy theory, who aren't going to do new econometric techniques, but can maybe be useful because I can go out and engineer a way to try to trick a firm into doing something that could teach us about things that we can't learn another way. And I think that for a certain kind of, the economic profession is very much moving in a very mathematical, abstract direction. And I think it's an antidote to that for the kind of people who don't fit in to the very technical space. So I really do believe still that the combination of collaborations with firms, big data, and randomization in what we call field experiments, natural field experiments, is absolutely going to be at the center of what economics is and what other social sciences are going forward. Now, if I look at it from the perspective of, a talking head on TV, okay, if I think about what I would say if somebody wanted me to talk on TV, I think my answer when asked about big data is that for most firms, I think that in the end, big data will be a net negative for them. Okay, now there are a set of firms, Google being absolutely the best example, who have completely and totally taken big data and made it something which is incredibly valuable, right? So, and Google is essentially in exactly the right spot, right? Because Google has gotten people to come tell them what they want, and it's a relatively easy problem to satisfy what people want, as opposed to what most companies are trying to do. So when I talk to other companies, they're companies that do something, like they sell life insurance or something. Say, look, we sell life insurance. Using big data, we should be able to sell these people, cars and sweaters and other things, because we know so much about them in life insurance. Okay? And the problem is that no one really wants that. My inbox is so crowded with junk, and now Gmail, for instance, is so good at taking all those out, so I never have to look at them, that pushing things onto me is just a very difficult way to go. Okay, so I think for most big firms, okay, and this is just an opinion, it's my impression based on what I've seen, that every big firm I talk to, many little firms I talk to, the conversation starts with big data. Okay, and they're not sure, the CEOs aren't sure why or what they're supposed to do with it, but they feel like they're getting left behind. So they feel like they should do something. Okay? And I think what's likely to happen is that they're going to make tremendous investments without having the right kind of talent around to think about the data, the right kind of infrastructure to do it, and end up just churning through a whole lot of wasted time and effort to not get very much out of it. Okay, so that's my opinion. Now, I'm wrong about most things, so I might be wrong about that, but it is definitely the feeling of when I have it. Now, when I think about it, if I were a CEO, okay, what would I do if I were a CEO? If I were a CEO, I would start with a huge investment in infrastructure. That what I've seen, even good firms do not have the IT structure to be able to do anything with their data. Okay, so I talked about the airline, I talked about the software company. It's surprising that companies you would think would be really good at this turn out to have no ability to do it. Okay, and I never would have imagined how absolutely critical this ability to link between data is, because big firms basically generate data for a bunch of different reasons. Like an airline has ticketing data, it has frequent flyer data, it has operational data about delays and whatnot, it has human resource data. And it turns out that it's very difficult to make these all talk to each other. But that's, in order to get the big payoff of big data, that's exactly what you need. Okay, and so, for instance, I worked with a bank where they tried to do that, and a year and a half later, a working group of 20 people still had not succeeded in pulling that off. I mean, it's just a really hard task. And so I think as a CEO, you have to decide, I'm going to really try to do this right or not do it at all. And the second thing I would do if I were CEO and I had these data is I would make it available to anyone, definitely within the firm. I even want to think about whether you want to make it available more broadly. Okay? And the reason is that the most interesting uses for data are rarely the use that they were generated for. Rarely the guy who records the data often doesn't have the ideas, and he doesn't have the idea for how the use to try to link multiple data together. So you need people in the organization who have ideas to be able to get access to the data. Now this is very scary. I think very scary for companies, both in terms of privacy laws, but also just in terms of worries about how to, what people are going to do with it, so right now, Capital One just got into trouble because a bunch of the people who worked there were looking and seeing how many people were using the charge cards at Chipotle, and then buying or selling short Chipotle and other stocks using that information. Okay. Now it's not Capital One's fault. I mean, these guys were just started probably having fun, seeing that the data were predictive, and then realized they could make a lot of money. Okay, but that's the kind of thing the CEO you worry about. But I think that's in some sense exactly what you want to happen, except you don't want the guy to be trading on it illegally. You want him to be, coming up with insights about what you should be doing with this data. The other thing I would do as a CEO is I would give people the time to actually try to think about these ideas. I think that there's a real lack of focus on thinking and idea generation in firms because people are busy and they have responsibilities. And I think that's a luxury that we have in academics, an incredible luxury that we have in academics, which isn't available to many people outside of academics. I would institute a rule in which I tried to make decision-making based on data and experimentation. It's really, so we're talking about big data, but what is even more shocking to me in business is how little experimentation. How easy it is in many settings to do true randomization, and how it is a gold standard in academics, and it's medicine, and it is virtually absent in most businesses, even many good businesses. And I think it's not just because people aren't trained to do it. I think it's something deeper. I think the real obstacle is in order to run this experiment, you have to start from the perspective that all academics start from, which is, I don't know. I don't know the answer, so I'm going to go write a research paper. I'm going to run an experiment. But the problem is in business, I think there's no 3 worst words you can ever say in business than I don't know. To admit that you don't know, if you're the head of marketing, is such a costly thing that you can never run an experiment because by running the experiment, you're already admitting you don't know. Okay? It's took me a long time to understand this, but I've really come to believe that it's true, that that's the biggest obstacle, is admitting ignorance is just verboten in firms. Okay, so that's what I would do if I were a CEO, and my guess is even then, I think I would probably fail changing firm culture enough to really make big data pay off. I think it's just a hard change to make. And the reason I think it's so hard, in the end, comes down to what I would do if I were a do-gooder. Right? So my perspective on big data, if I were a do-gooder, is that I would drop everything else I'm doing, and I would try to create a new form of education which would train people to thrive in a big data world. Okay? When you think about it, there's no particular degree path that is actually a very good training for what you want, and I don't know if you call them a data scientist, what they're called these days, but what you want from someone is the ability to be smarter, to understand data, right? To understand databases, to understand statistics, to know something about economics and marginal cost equal marginal benefit, something about human nature. Okay? And to be able to understand experimentation. It's a weird mix. Okay, so I don't think, I'd be wrong, but my impression is that the computer science programs I've seen, you don't do that at all. You learn how to program. Okay, and that's a piece of it, but a small piece of it. And statistics is maybe close, but the statisticians I've met tend not to care very much about the human side of problems. They tend to be interested in the nature of the data and whatnot, but not often to be all that effective. So I've met a lot of statisticians at firms, And what they do to me is what they do to everyone else, is they use really fancy jargon, super high-tech stuff that no one else understands, but makes a ton of sense and probably gives the right answer, but gives people the heebie-jeebies because they don't understand what they're talking about. And so when I work with companies, like I said, I like to show comparison of means, and that's often more effective than really complicated things for people who don't understand anything about statistics. Okay, so you need some statistics, but that can't really be what you have. I think actually an econ degree is not such a bad training for data science in the sense that you learn a bunch of things. But the PhD takes you off into hyperspace you have a lot of things that are never going to be useful. And I think an undergraduate degree doesn't teach you really enough of anything to make you prepared for it. Okay, in an MBA, in some sense, this is maybe a modern version of the MBA would be this thing. But the current MBA could not be further from what this is. So the current MBA has essentially zero content in this direction at all. I'm not even joking. So I tell you, I'm not really a do-gooder at heart, but at times I get taken over by do-gooding desires, and so I did indeed. So I believe that there is a valuable place in the world for creating some new, I don't know, call it a degree. I have no idea how you actually do it, but it's going to be some mix of these things, like something like an MBA or like an MPP, which is designed to create people who will thrive in a big data world. Okay? And I think, a little exaggerated to say do-gooder, in the sense that I think it will have tremendous private value for the people who do it, who take the degree. So I think you can charge them a ton of money for it. So but the do-gooding part is like getting the whole thing rolling. And anyone who wants to do it, I would encourage them to go and do it. I took one halting step in this direction. And I did it at the University of Chicago MBA program, Booth. Okay, and I thought, well, look, these are some of the best business school students in the world. And I'm going to offer a class. I did it with my colleague John List. And we focused less on big data and more on experimentation. Okay, so our class was on experiments in business. Okay? And what we did is, and it turned out to be an incredibly popular offering. Okay, that it was one of the most popular offerings. It was oversubscribed by like sixfold. They had to, and the beauty of the Chicago Business School is actually use prices to allocate, right? So the only people who got in our class are people who allocated every single bit of their budget to that one class, and had the other 3 classes they took just had to be whatever was for free. Okay, and so we had the most, the most motivated, qualified MBAs anywhere, and they came and took our class. And so John taught them the theory, the statistics, experimentation, and my only job was, and for 10 weeks, for an hour and a half, was to just tell them about examples of experiments that we and others had run in firms. Okay, so I could do about 3 per day. So over the course of the 10 weeks, I presented them 30 different experiments where we talk about what the problem was, how the randomization helped, how they did the randomization, what the application would be. Okay? People seemed to like the class, very enthusiastic, lots of participation. And just to show how far our do-gooding spirit was going, after the class was over, we invited all the students out for drinks to get their feedback on the class so we could see about how to make it better the next time. And the thing I remember so vividly was over beers, waited until the folks had had a couple beers so they might be more honest in their responses. And I said, so, what do you think? You think you'll use this on your jobs? Okay, and I should say, do-gooding is maybe a little exaggeration, because what we actually hoped we were doing was to send 80 automatons out into the world who thought Levitt and List know everything about experiments for the rest of my career. Whenever I have an interesting problem, I'm going to call my old professors on the phone and let them, get hundreds and hundreds of great academic papers out of this. Okay, and so I said, hey, what do you, what do you think? Is this something you'd ever use in your job? And I remember one person spoke and everyone else nodded, and he said, it was a really cool class, loved it, so entertaining. But I don't see how I could ever apply it in my job. And I said, well, why not? It seems like, what's your job? And he said, well, I do marketing at a beverage company. And I said, well, but wait a second. 2 of the experiments I talked about were marketing experiments at a beer company. He said, yeah, but I'm in soft drinks. And at that point, I thought, this is going to be a lot harder road to hoe than I had thought before. But anyway, that's what I had to talk to you about tonight. Thank you very much for your time.